Hi, Dr. Worch. This is my final presentation. I'm Wanda Short, and the title is Budgeting in a Volunteer Fire Department, and this is for the class Financial Management in the Public Sector, PAD 3204, with Professor Dr. Worch, Jr. Again, it's Wanda Short. I decided to talk about designing a budget for a volunteer fire department. And basically the overview of the history is since 6 AD in ancient Rome was the very first time that anybody rushed into a scene and tried to help instead of running away from the scene. Since then, there have been volunteers that have rushed forward and tried to help the situation and save lives. And as of 2013, the statistics are that there are 30,000 fire departments in the United States, and of them 19,800 are volunteer departments, with 100% of the staff are volunteers. There's an additional 5,700 departments that are mostly volunteer. So what that boils down to is out of 1,140,000 firefighters in the United States as of 2013, a whopping 786,000 of them were volunteer. That's 69% of all firefighters in the United States are volunteers. So this is a huge undertaking which has some unique challenges that would be different than a normal public service agency. Though people may not realize that a firefighter that responds is not compensated, as one reaches the volunteer fire department the same way they would reach a regular fire department through the use of 911. So people don't realize that the person that's responding may be a volunteer or may be a full-time staff member or a combination of both. Some fire departments do utilize on-call staff, which means they're volunteers, so they have regular full-time jobs at their own call. So if they're needed, then they respond to the scene, and then while they're at the scene, they are compensated for the time that they're there. So there's completely paid, and then there's partially paid or on-call, and then there's volunteer firefighters. But a volunteer fire department is made up of men and women who work as firefighters without being on the full-time staff. Volunteer firefighters may work for the fire department, and they may be fully compensated or not at all compensated. The need to have staffing at peak levels or during crisis situations is one of the main reasons that volunteer firefighters are utilized, but also because of budgeting constraints. It's much cheaper to have volunteer firefighters or even on-call firefighters versus having a staff that's sitting around waiting for a fire or an emergency to erupt. It's interesting, though, that in Argentina, the term for their volunteer firefighters is voler e potere, which means willing is to be able. And in Chile, every fire department is 100% volunteer staff, which in the United States, again, it's 69%. But just as with any private company, a volunteer fire department does need to have a vision in order to thrive. A vision can be something that really motivates not only that station and the staff that are there, but the community at large to really get behind it and to support it. A vision is different than a strategic plan, as it goes way beyond the financial aspects of budgeting and planning, but it's really a snapshot of the community and how the good of the department is going to benefit that community for those it serves. The other benefit of having a well-established vision is a sense of belonging to something important that those who are working within and volunteering for a department can really get behind. Once a vision is developed, it can be brought into being and shared with all the operations, and then it should always be, and then all operations should then be funneled back through the vision. This allows for a clear focus of how policy and procedures are created and followed and enforced, that all follow under one vision with everyone standing behind it. While the statistics do show that the volunteer force makes up 69% of all firefighters, the trend is actually showing a decline. showing a decline in the numbers of volunteer firefighters, but it's also showing an increase in the age of the current firefighters. So the volunteer firefighters that are on staff now are continuing in their posts, but they're not getting a lot of new blood. In fact, since 1984, the sheer number of volunteers has dropped 18%. The age of the firefighter, again, is increasing, which brings about some other issues, which I talk about more in my paper. But this startling fact has actually driven some fire stations to change the way they've designed their stations. When you think about a fire station, normally you would think of it being kind of a sanctuary for the firefighters and for the volunteers and paid staff to kind of go and rest between their responding calls, and also kind of as a little bit of a sanctuary. But now with the changes in how the volunteer department is growing and the numbers are dropping, those stations are now being converted into more of a training area or a public relations area. They're more for show and for bringing the public in to see what it's all about. So while it's noted that in the United States volunteerism is an all-time high, there are several reasons that the volunteer fire department is seeing a decline in their people who are enlisting to volunteer. One of them is really due to the increased amount of training that's required and competencies. There's a lot of demands put on these volunteer firefighters, just as if they were fully understaffed and being paid full time, to keep up with their competencies and certifications, their annual education, and it can be quite an issue time-wise for these people. Another area that is really important in this is that companies now are not as apt to let their staff rush off and volunteer in other areas. Companies in the U.S. are feeling the financial pinch. They're tightening their budgets as well. They're downsizing their staff numbers, so the staff that they maintain must work at 100% capacity. So it's not as a given as it may have been several decades ago that you can just take time off to go volunteer and at a moment's notice even leave to help out the community. And that's a shame, but that is indicative of a nation that's seen companies downsize and tighten up their own financial budgets. That remains one of the biggest issues currently within fire departments across the country. There are three main areas of laws and ordinances that cover volunteer firefighters or fire departments. The first one is under Chapter 175 of the Florida statutes. Part 41 actually addresses the provisions of a pension trust fund being created that applies to both volunteer and full-time staff, and it outlines the details on establishing and maintaining those funds. Chapter 286 is sort of better known as a sunshine law, and that actually really looks at how meetings are run, how information is disseminated out to the public, and the access that the public has to the inside workings of the departments. Chapter 633 is really devoted completely to fire and fire prevention and control. And it covers a lot of different areas. We're going to actually talk real quickly about each part of Chapter 633. Part 1 is the general provisions, and that covers the definitions and the authority levels, their roles and fees and compensations. Part 2 of Chapter 633 is the fire safety and prevention area, which includes the codes and standards of operation. So this will cover the fire safety norms and standards, inspections, as well as discipline and violations, holding people accountable, and how to exactly process all of that information. Part 3 is the fire protection and suppression, and that's responsible for everything from the safety boards, memberships, meetings, equipment requirements, special powers, records, certificates, fire alarm system equipment, really anything that involves all of those specific components. Part 4 is the standards and training section, and that covers all the required standards, training, competencies that's necessary from the hiring of and retaining and recertifying of all firefighters, whether volunteer or fully paid. This also includes any disciplinary actions for failing to maintain standards and even falsification of qualifications. Part 5, which is the Occupational Safety and Health Act, this outlines the compliance, safety, workplace safety, injuries, firefighters' rights and responsibilities, and anything that falls along those lines would fall under Part 5 of Chapter 633. Moving into financial components, there are different layers of a budget that any volunteer fire department must utilize. The capital budget would include all those high-cost items that typically have an extended period of time in service, or they're only acquired as needed, such as vehicles, big equipment, buildings, things like that. These are things that are above and beyond your normal daily, day-to-day operational expenses. The line item budget is the part of the budget that actually takes each area and spells out specifically every single item that is purchased. This can include fuel, paper products, supplies, equipment, supplies that are used and discarded, etc. The program budget will cover the expenses that fall under the programs that are created within the fire department. This could be community outreach or education or working with the youth or anything like that. The expense budget contains the items that recur over time. They just continue to recur constantly. Gas, training, personnel, things like that. Another crucial aspect of the public agency budgeting is the follow system of preparation, approval, implementation, and audit review. Breaking these each down is really important to understand that each area has certain criteria involved that must be strictly adhered to. The first stage of preparation includes forecasting, estimating, revenue researching, expenditure forecasting, and all the costs involved in operating the agency for a specific period of time. This is a lengthy process that if you skimp on it, then the entire process, the whole budget could be worthless. So this is an area that does take some time and consideration. The next stage after that is approval. The approval must come from whoever has the authority to do it. This part must be done correctly, and depending on the community or the culture or the environment where that department is, could dictate how exactly this is approached. But we'll talk about political aspects later on in the paper. The next step is the most difficult, implementation. This is actually where you're putting your money where you said it would. Where you're putting your mouth where you're putting your money where your mouth said it would go. This is when you have to enact on the things that you stated that you would do, and you follow through, and you can prove exactly where every single dollar is going and how it's being used. This is where success and failure may become evident very quickly. So budget managers should be prepared at the beginning of the budget cycle to really pay close attention to that and see if there's any trends or areas that were misconstrued or need to be adjusted. The final stage is to audit, review, and evaluate. This happens on a continual schedule, especially in a public service organization where the public is their trust factor is very much a part of the importance of being transparent and making sure that the corruption is limited, minimized, and even expelled. And if there is found to be some corruption, that it is dealt with quickly and amply and completely. There are some other sources and have taken those same steps and then kind of changed them into 4 areas with a slightly different component. I liked it, so I wanted to add it in here. This one source breaks it down into 4 areas. The formulation phase, which is the phase of actually pulling together a task force of a diverse group of managers and leaders and even public figures to work together to review previous budgets, brainstorm the needs for the new year, and come up with an actual viable plan. This way you get more people involved, there's more buy-in, and the community seems to be behind it a little more because they feel like they've had a say. The transmittal phase is the simple or could be complex process that basically decides exactly who has the authority to approve this budget. This seems pretty simple, but it is not always. This could be a fire chief, it could be a board of fire commissioners, it could be a government agency, or another entity or person. The next phase is the approval phase. So whoever is decided to have the authority goes ahead and reviews the budget and either approves it, denies it, or sends it back for rework, which is certainly a part of the budgeting process. The last phase in this other viewpoint is the management phase. So just as the implementation stage that we spoke of earlier, this stage is the one where you put your money where your mouth is. This phase also includes working with what you're given. So if you didn't quite get as much money as you thought you were, now is the time to either make your case or find other avenues and sources of income. Those avenues of income could come from fundraising, community support, taxes, and other things like grants and things like that. So that's when you would need to start looking and getting things mobilized. The political and technical aspects. First of all, obviously, anytime you're dealing with government, whether local, state, federal, or whatever, global, there are politics. There are people who have egos. There are people with agendas. There are people who don't have the common good at heart. This can definitely cripple a volunteer fire department, as any other agency. And in one case, one of my sources showed a specific incident where a fire was alarmed, and there were 4 fire stations within proximity. 3 of the fire stations immediately sent out rigs with staff, and they were between 5.5 and 6.5 miles away. However, there was a station that was a mere 352 yards away from this burning home. They refused to respond. When it was researched why that station did not respond, it was found to be because there was a feud going on between that station and the township where the fire occurred. The township manager did not want that fire station responding to any calls within that township. Therefore, that fire station didn't. Now, what this did was it delayed help. It caused the structure to completely burn to the ground. Could have cost lives if there were people trapped inside. It endangered the other 3 stations' employees because when they got there, even though it took just a few minutes longer, the fire was already even more out of control. These kind of politics can have a hugely negative impact on response time and saving lives and property. These consequences should not just be poo-pooed away. Even the state fire commissioner got involved, but his hands are tied. As legislatively, there's nothing that really forces, especially volunteer fire departments, to respond to certain calls. So that's some sort of legislature that may be changing in the future. Technology, on the other hand, has been just going through the roof. As with EMS and fire and police, we have seen the onset in the last few decades of technological advances that have just been startling. 2 really powerful technical advances have been the 3D firefighting module, which allows for firefighters to get control of a fire quickly because they attack it from more than one side. Also, the thermal imaging camera has saved countless lives. This is an advancement that allows for you to look into a fire situation, spot the highest parts of the hottest parts of the fire, even see where the fire originated, even see areas that are getting ready to flash back or to explode. And this has been just an amazing technological advance. Revenue and expenditures, the term volunteer usually means non-compensated or evokes the feeling that no money is involved at all. That's really not accurate. They still have a budget, they still receive money, they still have to operate. It's not a free venture. When you call 911 and the people come and they save you and your home, that's not free. It costs. Even if that person is a volunteer, there still is a specific budgeting process that looks at revenue and expenditures. This is not standardized throughout the nation, unfortunately. So some communities, especially communities that have a higher wealth involved, are much better off with their technology, their equipment, their staff, because they can spend more money on that. Lower socioeconomic areas, not so much. Where does the money come from? The money can come from a municipal budget, which is raised from local or state taxes. It can come from raising money from the citizens with special taxation. It can come from assessing user fees, which that can kind of not be a great one to depend on, because sometimes the users who are receiving help from the fire department aren't able to be in a position to pay. So, and then you run the legality side of that, of having to track them down and get their money. Also, you can borrow. You can get grants or funds from other governmental agencies, or you can ask people for donations, do some basic fundraising. But really, any one of those components can be utilized, or even a combination of them, to have a functioning fire department. Supplemental income is crucial, and it also goes to remember that anytime you have a budget and revenue and expenditures, especially in a public arena, you have that accountability. It's much different than at a private organization level. Again, the public's trust counts on transparency and also on knowing where every bit's going, how it's being used, how it's benefiting them. So that's another aspect to really consider. Some ethical concerns are, with the lack of compensation for the volunteer firefighters, they get burned out. They're putting a lot of hours in training and competencies and continuing education, not to mention the time that they're on the job actually working and not being compensated. That is something that is an ethical concern. Also, using volunteer firefighters as a resource to save money in a local or state budget, I think is a huge ethical concern, because that is not right. It gives the public the wrong idea of what these people are doing, and it can come back and bite you, especially as seen in some of the cases where the unions have gone on strike and totally walked off the job and left whole communities just wanting and not having an emergency response system. The training for volunteer firefighters is not standardized. They are not at this moment held completely as accountable as a paid person is. That can be a problem. You could have people with outdated competencies, outdated certifications, outdated training, out there in the field making life and death situation and decisions, and that is definitely an area that is of concern. The competency is definitely important. One source that I read up on is a superintendent and a volunteer firefighter, and he's actually taken up the challenge of identifying some different questions to ask when he's formulating his training specifically for his volunteer firefighters. And I thought this was interesting, so I wanted to close with this. He asked, are the certification levels comprehensive? Is the delivery of training sufficient? Should all training be certifiable? Does the training require proving mastery? And is there a system to validate whether the training is in line with the duties that they will perform? These questions form the framework for training as more in line with what a firefighter will need in order to do his or her job to the best possible ability. Unfortunately, not all departments have a comprehensive plan in place such as this. But all in all, the ethical concerns that our volunteer firefighters face should be looked at closely, and this group of noble men and women who effortlessly, selflessly offer their time and talent should be treated with the utmost dignity and respect. And then here are the references. You can also see them on the research paper. And I thank you so much, Dr. Worch, for yet another hugely interesting and eye-opening course. I look forward to the next class that I have with you. Thank you.